Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about the process behind creating the art, and then Jeremy can talk a little bit more about the process behind creating the text. So obviously a game like Dungeons & Dragons, tabletop role-playing game, presented in book format, whether it's an ebook or a physical book, essentially the text and your graphic elements, including art, are how you're going to present the game. And in some ways, it's like when I think of the art and what we did, I kind of almost wish it was like more complicated than it actually was. Like there may be more to talk about, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Like Jeremy mentioned earlier, it was really just about thinking about our audience, who's in our audience, and what do different members of our audience want to see. And so for us, in creating the art and deciding which characters we wanted to portray, just as we would think, well, we have people who have been playing D&D for 40 years, and this is a style they like, or there are people who really like fighting, it's all about combat, or it's really about storytelling, we just took the different segments of our audience by gender, sexuality, gender identity, race, and just approached our art in the same way, and just said, look, for every person out there who plays D&D, we wanted art that they could look at and say, hey, that's the hero I want to be. That's me. That could be my character, or that could be me in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And I mentioned earlier this idea of mindfulness, of just keeping it front of mind, because it is very easy to just forget, to just kind of default to the way things have been done. And I think this is actually a very good exercise to engage in, because I think that awareness of trying to change things applies across the board in game design. It's very easy to fall into tired genre tropes, or that your storytelling it's another story about an evil, mysterious corporation in the near future that's trying to undermine the world and blah, blah, blah. Games, it's very easy in anything creative to fall into stereotypes, to fall into things that people have seen before, and to fall into the tired old tropes. And that really was a lot of it for us, was to just not default to generic Western Europe medieval fantasy. We wanted to go a lot bigger. We also really wanted to build a setting that was visually interesting and visually unique. And so using that language of the setting we were working from, the Forgotten Realms is sort of like, it's the most popular D&D world. There are other D&D ones, but the Realms is the most popular one. And it's one I think resonates the most with D&D players. Not everyone, obviously, but just in terms of the way it presents the world, it really fits well into the world of Dungeons & Dragons, the concepts behind the game. So a lot of the process for us was taking a step back and looking at our world and thinking, the Realms is a very diverse place. There's a lot of different cultures, different ethnicities, different looks, and different elements to these cultures, and really taking a deep dive into the lore. The setting's been around for almost as long as Dungeons & Dragons in one form or another. The guy who created Ed Greenwood, I think he was 8 when he wrote his first short story set in the Realms, and eventually became his campaign world in the 70s in D&D. And so just going through and pulling out those different cultures and doing these real deep cultural studies. What are these cultures like? The people from this culture, what do they look like? What makes them different? What their dress, their rituals, their weapons, their armor, all this other stuff. And all of that fed into an art Bible that we put together as a visual reference guide for D&D. And not just for the role-playing game, but if it's a video game or comic book or anything else for D&D. All this stuff went together to really create the visual vocabulary that informs the art of Dungeons & Dragons. And then what that did was it created an important pivot point when we were working with artists in the outside world. And if Jeremy, if you want to go through and show off some of the art, I know he bookmarked some of the pages in the player's handbook to kind of show off some of this stuff. Yeah, so what we really did was in the past, when we would try to do things that were getting away from stereotypes in art, the artists would often have this sort of gravitational pull back toward the same old, right? That if we had described this character up here in terms of like real world terms, okay, we want an African-American woman, she's a cleric, I think she's a cleric of, do you know what deity that is? Yeah, I think it's Agma. I'm totally blowing. We'd have Matt Cernit here would know all the details. I'm totally blowing my intelligence check here. But we would find that artists would literally, like anything that was about an ethnicity or a different visual look, it was just like their eyes would glaze right over it. And we would get white European guy, and then all the other details correct. It's a cleric of Agma and all this other stuff. And I don't know exactly why that's happening. I think it'd be a real mistake to attribute that it's just, it's people artists going out of their way, they just only want to draw white people. I think what was happening was, it was just, when you're a professional artist and you're drawing lots of characters, it's easy when you're looking at, say, the 15 sketches you have to do for Dungeons & Dragons to just default to what you know you've seen in D&D up to this point. And kind of, that, rather than having to go through and really analyze the art order and the art description, kind of, see enough of it to kind of know the gist of what you're supposed to draw, then fill in the rest with the stereotypes that you sort of built up over the years of what you expect D&D to do. So what we did was essentially exterminate all those stereotypes and that sort of blank canvas people were inadvertently finding by forcing people to learn the new vocabulary of the cultures and the references of the Forgotten Realms. So rather than say, we want someone who's sort of an African-inspired look or, someone with very dark skin, we would say, no, we want, okay, this is a Tarami female. And that's all we would say. And so they're seeing the word Tarami, which means nothing to the arts. Like it's they don't know what that means. They have absolutely no idea what they're supposed to do. That drives them to the visual style guide we did, where we really went out of our way to show some, lots of examples, lots of different reference points, and really tried to do things with the gear and the armor you can see in this character to make it visually interesting and also visually distinct for each one. So the artists enjoyed being able to be more creative than they otherwise could, right? We gave them a good incentive to move away from the stereotypes by showing them, hey, it's okay to do things that are different. It's okay to have fun with some of this costuming and stuff, because we're going to show you examples that are all they're doing is pushing you away from the stereotypes that have been accumulated over the years. Now, obviously that's not for everything where we want a diverse cast, but for characters that we wanted to stand out that were not normally in the past depicted in D&D, it was important for us to make the process of drawing them really fun, really engaging, and really show support by giving them lots of visual reference to, again, be really mindful of the fact that the stereotypes, the sort of, not stereotypes, but the sort of cliches of the past have a very powerful gravitational pull on creators. And especially in a commercial environment where people have deadlines, and they have a lot of work to get through, the more we could do to make it the easy way out was to embrace what we were trying to do rather than to backslide to the old way of doing things. And if you're in the talk here last week, I kind of mentioned this. I think what happens for a lot of, especially people working freelance or people who maybe don't have a lot of experience, they're starting out, I think people always just get nervous about doing the wrong thing. They want to make sure that they're giving a client the thing they want to see. And I think that's really where the sort of, the cliches and the way things have always been really rears its head is just in the appeal, I guess, of the perception that that's the safe way to go. If you do what's been done 100 times before, that's safe. No one's going to get mad at you. No one's going to get upset. And that, again, goes back to this idea of being very mindful of it, of knowing, it's okay to show Western European-style armor. It's just we don't want that to be all of it. We want to have a large, diverse cast of characters that are really appealing to the entirety of our audience, not just to one chunk of our audience. So that was really a lot of the process behind the art, was being very mindful of it, rebuilding our vocabulary so our artists were not just sliding back into the way things were being done. They were moving forward. They wanted to move forward. We made it exciting and interesting for them to embrace what we were doing. And on our end, just keeping it up, just making sure we're always being mindful. So for instance, in our own internal process for art orders, you had to specify the ethnicity of any humanoid character we did. It was just, the art order was not considered complete, was not ready to be shipped out until that had been done. And once we did it a couple times, everyone now just does it automatically because people just know, just like any other spec doc, here's what you're supposed to do this thing. People just do it. So it was just a constant effort. And this is something where we're still working on. We're still kind of sorting out how we want to tackle everything. And it's always being work in progress. And I think that's also part of it too, is realizing we know we didn't get it perfectly right the first time. We think we did better, but we still think we have a ways to go. And we always want to be mindful of criticism, feedback, reactions, and always keeping those in mind, and always knowing it's a conversation, it's not just a statement. So that's essentially the art process in a nutshell. Being mindful of it, holding up those standards, and really, again, the creativity behind it, always focusing on building an interesting thing and building diversity into that from the beginning, rather than trying to approach it as, oh, this is something which is, it's outside the process. It's something that is just baked right into our process.
Yeah, another way of phrasing what Mike is talking about is we achieved ethnic diversity in our work through world building. And this is actually a really important trick to use, especially again, as Mike said, if you have artists who are used to falling into certain visual ruts. You know, if they're portraying characters in the same way over and over again. If you make a world that is engaging, that is diverse, your creatives are going to want to engage with that world. And so, yeah, we almost felt like we had performed a magic trick because we had actually for years been trying to make our art more diverse. And so we, again, as Mike said, would constantly say, you know, we want this character to look Asian, we want this other character to look Indian, we want this other character to look African, and then we'd end up with yet another white person. But it was suddenly that magic of as soon as we were not referring to real world ethnicities, but we're referring to our imaginary world, where the artist could not avoid the fact that these fantasy humans from this particular part of the world were black, the artists all did what we wanted them to do, because they were illustrating our world that we were creating. It's a bizarre psychology. We could probably examine that and then do an entire lecture on why that was the case, why world building ended up being the most reliable avenue for us to achieve our goal. But again, I think that would be for a different talk.
Or psychologists.
Yeah, because it's a psychological analysis. And it's particularly fascinating to us because in our work, and this is true of many fantasy and science fiction games, characters of many species are very common. But if you think about the video games you've played, except for more recent ones, this is changing, thankfully. Humans are rarely depicted with the diversity that actual human beings have. And so that's why we were very conscious about the fact that for the player's handbook, our human is a black woman. And you'll see even on this page, we have in a way the mission statement for 5th edition, which is variety in all things, which is the header right underneath it. But we also did things like when you take a look at our bard, we love this character because in the office, each person in the office has a different theory on what this character's gender is. Now, this character is actually gender fluid, and again, that's on purpose. And again, we were able to achieve this because we grounded it in world building. There's a piece of text in the book where we talk about the fact that the elves of Dungeons and Dragons, and this is actually a bit of our lore that goes all the way back to the 70s, their god is gender fluid. And some elves are blessed by also being gender fluid. It is considered to be a blessing among the elves. And so here our bard is of an indeterminate gender, and that is, again, to the elves, a blessing. We also have the standards. We have a very dwarfy dwarf.
Dwarfy McDwarfison.
It would not be D&D without a very dwarfy dwarf. But again, I love this guy. He again is from across the sea from Cormyr.
No, he's Turami.
Oh yeah, he's also Turami.
Yeah. Cormyr. No,
No,
this is something where we.
across the sea from Cormyr.
Oh, across the sure.
Yes.
You know, again, more knowledge checks. I don't know. Yeah. No, but this is something where, like, for the artist, we tried. If you look at the armor, compared to the cleric, we wanted to make something that was different. Because one of the challenges we saw, and this maybe speaks. I'm going to extemporize a little bit about the psychology of our artists, but if things all started to look the same, they all became the same, and I think the art we got was not as interesting back in the day when artists would just, oh, thank you. Yeah, that's just awkward. No, I will hold it. So when everything started to look, when we didn't have a lot of detail and a lot of the world detail we baked into the armor and gear, I think what was happening was the artists just kind of felt they're on an assembly line. Every character was the same, so they drew them the same, and they weren't quite bringing the same spark. When we really came out with strong direction for here's 18 different cultures, here's 18 different styles of chainmail and plate mail and leather armor and a spear and a weapon, we were getting much better art because we were giving our artists a visual vocabulary that was a lot more interesting. If an artist was getting 6 characters, they weren't getting 6 of the same thing. They were getting 6 very, very different looking characters. If you can imagine the three examples Jeremy just gave, for someone drawing those are 3 very different characters to really get into and illustrate. And I think what was happening was our artists had a lot more fun depicting each individual character because it had busted them out of the rote routine of just another, typical fantasy character, blah. And this one's got leather armor and a club, and this one's got chainmail and a spear, and this one, and it seemed like we were getting a lot more personality in the art. We were getting a lot more dynamic poses. We're getting artists who just seemed much more engaged in the work, because by understanding what it's in our experience, the artists we work with, by giving them more variety and more space, more safety lines, more examples to work from, more things that were grounded directly. And here's what this armor looks like. If you follow this guideline, we're not going to fuss at you and make you redo it and waste your time and keep you from your next job. Instead, we're going to give you very strong guidance for the details, and then give you a lot of freedom to depict a character who's interesting and dynamic. And that seemed to really help the results. And so far in the reviews we've gotten for 5th edition, people have spoken very highly of the art. And I think that is a direct result of the approach we took to really let the artists have fun by essentially telling them, look, it's okay to do interesting things. We're going to give you a lot of examples and a lot of guidance on how to depict diversity and use that to fuel an escape route from the rote, dull repetition of everyone has to look the same, and that actually gets kind of boring after a while, and we're getting dull art. This is actually kind of a great example of a character. Like, we didn't have a lot of this detail, the kind of creepiness of, her eyes, the way you can see there, and her gear. That was all from the artist. We would just say, okay, we want a human female warlock from the Shu Empire, and that was it. Everything here, that kind of creepy Halloween kind of vibe, that was the artist injecting that. So it was giving our artists a lot more room to be creative by giving them license to give us different looking characters.
You'll also notice that with this character, this Asian-looking woman is also middle-aged. That's a little bit of diversity that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is we actually wanted to see characters of different ages, because it's very common for characters in games to settle somewhere in their 20s, maybe their early 30s, and then it's like no other human beings exist.
And that is also because self-service, because we're both 40. Well, I'm pushing 40.
That's right.
So we had to see a couple geezers so to help ourselves.
I also want to pause here because we have a lot of women depicted in our art, and we pushed very hard for the women in our art to not fall into the chainmail bikini stereotype. The women, as you've seen so far, are as fully fledged in their design as the male characters. We wanted the female characters to look just as powerful, to have just as much volition, to be something you would want to aspire to, just like any of the other characters. And this is, again, not only important because of our audience. We want women to feel comfortable with this game. And we already know we have thousands of women who love this game, and we want them to be comfortable with it, to feel like the game speaks to them and understands them. But also because it's a role-playing game, and this is really true of all role-playing games, we want to invite people to consider more types of characters to play. Because I think one of the powerful cultural phenomena that rests within role-playing games is exactly that, the role-playing. The settling into a character who is not you. And sure, part of it might just be to have a good time. Hey, I slew some monsters, I learned a good story. But I think often in the best role-playing games along the way, you actually learn a little bit more about other people's experience. And it could be as simple as you played through Mass Effect and you're a dude and your shepherd was a woman. That experience might have given you a perspective that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so one of the reasons we want our characters to be very diverse is for our players to expand in their minds when they think, what kind of character do I want to play? We want them to have a huge, wonderfully diverse menu of options. It's like, I always play, like in my case, I'm always playing old geezer wizards.
Old geezer elf wizards.
Yeah, well, sometimes elves, although the elves are usually young.
By elves.
But yeah, just to encourage people to think, what's another kind of character I could play? And then hopefully, is there something about other people's experience in the real world I might learn from playing such